It was an early morning, and the airport was busy with people rushing to catch their flights. Among the crowd was Agent Daniel Carter, a black FBI agent who had just finished a long day of meetings and was on his way back home. Daniel was calm and focused, carrying his work in a small bag, ready to enjoy a quiet flight. He made his way through the terminal, grabbed a quick cup of coffee, and then headed to his gate. His flight was to be a short one, just a few hours, but it was always nice to have some quiet time away from work. He boarded the plane, found his seat, and settled in. It was a full flight, with every seat taken, and Daniel was seated next to a woman who seemed to be in her late 40s. The woman, who Daniel would later refer to as Karen in his mind, gave him a quick glance as he sat down. She looked at him for a moment, then went back to her phone. Daniel had learned over the years to ignore unnecessary glances, so he did the same, putting on his headphones and opening a file on his laptop. But Karen wasn't the type to leave things alone. She began by making a small comment to Daniel. "Looks like you have a pretty important job there," she said, her voice a little too loud. Daniel took off his headphones and gave her a polite smile. "It's just work," he replied calmly, hoping she wouldn't continue. But Karen didn't take the hint. She leaned in a little closer and raised an eyebrow. "What do you do exactly? You look like someone who could be important," she asked with a strange tone. Daniel was used to people asking about his work. Being an FBI agent often led to curiosity, but he didn't mind explaining. He knew how to handle these questions with professionalism. "I'm an FBI agent," he said simply, trying to keep the conversation brief. Karen's eyes widened, and she looked him up and down. "FBI? Really?" she said in a tone that suggested she didn't believe him. "You don't look like the type of person they hire for that job." Daniel tried to brush it off. He knew what she meant. People often had preconceived ideas about what an FBI agent should look like, and it wasn't uncommon for him to be judged based on his appearance. But he didn't let it bother him. "That's a common misconception," Daniel said, his voice steady. "The FBI hires people from all walks of life." Karen seemed to be waiting for more, as though she expected Daniel to prove himself to her. She leaned back in her seat, eyeing him like she was trying to figure him out. Daniel, however, didn't feel the need to explain further. He looked back down at his laptop, hoping the conversation would end there. But Karen wasn't finished. She turned her attention back to her phone for a moment, then quickly looked at Daniel again, making sure he was paying attention. "Must be hard, huh?" she said, "being in a job like that. And well, you know." Her voice trailed off as she looked him up and down again. Daniel raised an eyebrow, sensing where this was going. He knew what she was hinting at, and he wasn't sure how much more he wanted to engage with her. But the fact that she had mentioned his race bothered him, even though she hadn't said it outright. He decided to remain polite but firm. "It's a job like any other," Daniel said. "The work's tough, but I'm good at it." Karen smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Instead, it seemed like she was sizing him up, waiting to see if he backed down. Daniel felt the tension rising, but he didn't let it show. He went back to his work, hoping the flight would pass quickly without any more uncomfortable encounters. But as the plane started to ascend into the sky, Daniel had a feeling this wouldn't be a simple flight. As the plane soared high into the sky, Daniel tried to settle into the rhythm of the flight. The seatbelt sign was off, and passengers around him began to relax. Some were reading, others were chatting, and a few were drifting off to sleep. Daniel, however, remained focused on his work, going through a series of documents on his laptop. It was rare that he got this much quiet time, and he was determined to make the most of it. But Karen wasn't done. She had been quiet for a few minutes, and Daniel had hoped that maybe she had lost interest. However, he soon felt her eyes on him again. He looked up, and sure enough, she was staring at him, a strange, almost judgmental look on her face. "Isn't it dangerous, being in a job like that?" she asked, her voice loud enough for a few people nearby to hear. I mean, FBI agents are always getting involved in dangerous situations, right? Daniel sighed inwardly. He had been hoping to avoid this kind of conversation. He had been in plenty of tough situations during his career, but he didn't feel the need to share those stories with a stranger. Still, he wasn't the type to back down either, especially when he could sense that Karen was pushing him. "I'm trained for it," he replied calmly, "and it's part of the job." Karen wasn't satisfied with that answer. She leaned forward, her face becoming more serious. "But don't you feel out of place? I mean, I bet there are a lot of people in the FBI who are. Well, let's just say, they're probably more like the typical image of an agent, tall, white, and, fit. You don't exactly fit that profile," she said with an almost mocking tone. Daniel paused for a moment. He felt the old familiar frustration bubbling up inside him, but he kept his voice steady. "There's no profile for being an FBI agent," Daniel said, looking her in the eyes. "The FBI hires the best people, regardless of how they look." Karen seemed to ignore his words, instead focusing on her own thoughts. "Yeah, well," she said with a half-laugh, "I guess I just don't see how someone like you could handle such a serious job. The FBI is all about keeping people safe, and I don't know if you can really do that." Daniel's hands gripped the edges of his laptop as he fought to keep his cool. It was clear now that Karen's comments weren't just curiosity. They were judgmental and dismissive. She was questioning his abilities based purely on his race and appearance, and it felt deeply unfair. He could feel the eyes of other passengers turning toward them, but he chose not to engage in a full confrontation. Instead, he smiled politely, trying to diffuse the tension. "I spent years training and working hard to be where I am," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "I've earned my position, and I'm proud of the work I do." Karen didn't seem convinced. She crossed her arms and let out a little chuckle, as if she found the whole conversation amusing. "I'm sure you've done your best," she said, but her tone suggested that she didn't believe it. Daniel felt a surge of frustration, but he stayed composed. He had dealt with ignorant comments before, but it was different when they were coming from someone sitting right next to him. This wasn't just a random comment. It was an attack on his identity and his career. The flight attendants had begun to move through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. Daniel took a deep breath, deciding that it wasn't worth escalating the situation any further. He turned back to his laptop, trying to ignore Karen's continued stares. But Karen didn't let it go. She was waiting for him to respond, her eyes fixed on him like she was daring him to say something. Daniel couldn't help but wonder, how long would it take before this conversation finally ended? The atmosphere in the airplane cabin was starting to feel more and more uncomfortable. While most of the passengers had settled into their own little worlds, Daniel could feel Karen's gaze fixed on him. It was hard to ignore, especially when she would occasionally let out a little chuckle or shake her head, as though she found his presence funny or strange. Daniel knew that her behavior wasn't normal, but he also knew that getting upset wasn't going to help. He tried to focus on his work again, but her voice broke through. "So," Karen said loudly enough for a few nearby passengers to hear, "is it true that you guys just get sent in wherever there's a big problem? Like, do you even get to choose your cases, or do they just send you to places that don't even make sense for you?" Daniel tried to keep his tone neutral. "We work on many cases, and most of the time, they're based on our skills and experience," he answered, hoping the conversation would end there. But Karen was determined to push further. "Really? Because, I mean, what kind of skills could you possibly have that make you the right person for dangerous situations? You don't exactly look like someone who would be chasing down criminals or handling big problems." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, and his grip tightened on his laptop. It was clear now that Karen wasn't just asking questions out of curiosity. She was trying to make him feel small, to undermine his confidence and his place in the FBI. "Everyone in the FBI is trained to handle difficult situations," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "It's not about how we look. It's about what we can do." Karen raised an eyebrow. clearly not convinced. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "I just feel like someone with your background doesn't exactly fit the usual image of an FBI agent. I mean, aren't they supposed to be? I don't know. More like what we see in the movies." Daniel knew exactly what she meant. The stereotype of the tall, white, and powerful FBI agent had been around for years. It was frustrating to hear, especially from someone who had no idea what it took to get to where he was. But instead of responding with anger, Daniel took a slow, deep breath. "The FBI values results, not appearances," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "What matters is our ability to do the job, not how we look while doing it." Karen let out a dismissive laugh. "Yeah, okay, but I still think you're not what I expected. You're not exactly the hero type. It's hard to imagine someone like you handling all the danger that comes with that job." The words stung, but Daniel refused to let them show. He knew that people like Karen held these outdated beliefs, but he also knew that it wasn't his job to change them. Still, he couldn't just let her continue without saying something. He'd had enough of her questioning his skills, his role, and his worth based solely on her assumptions. "I'm here to do a job, just like anyone else," he said firmly. "And if you think I'm not capable, that's your problem, not mine." Karen's face flushed slightly, and she seemed taken aback by his response. For a brief moment, the tension seemed to lift. But then, she tried to recover with a snide remark. "Well, I'm just saying," she muttered. "It's a bit surprising that someone like you gets to do such important work, but I guess everyone gets their chance." The silence between them was thick, and Daniel could feel the eyes of nearby passengers turning toward them. He tried to focus on the flight, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was waiting for him to react. He simply kept his composure, unwilling to let her get under his skin. As the plane continued its journey, Daniel couldn't help but wonder, how much longer would this go on? And would it be possible to make it to his destination without further confrontation? The flight was beginning to feel longer than it actually was. Daniel had hoped that after their brief exchange, Karen would drop the topic and leave him to enjoy the rest of his journey in peace, but that wasn't happening. Karen had found something she believed she could challenge, and now she wasn't backing down. She was still staring at him, not in a curious way, but with a sense of judgment, as if she was waiting for him to prove that he belonged in the FBI. Daniel tried to ignore her and focus on his work, but her voice broke the silence again. "So tell me," Karen said loudly enough for others to hear, "do you ever get nervous when you're out there dealing with all those criminals and dangerous situations? I mean, it must be pretty scary, right?" Daniel, trying to keep his voice steady, glanced at her briefly. "Everyone gets nervous at times. But it's not about fear. It's about doing the job right, no matter the situation." Karen smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they think they know better than you, when they believe they have control over the conversation. She leaned in a little closer. "I don't know. I just feel like it's kind of hard to take you seriously," she said, her tone not so much curious now as critical. "I mean, you're not exactly what people would picture when they think of an FBI agent. You're more, well, how do I say this? Different, I guess." Daniel's patience was starting to wear thin. He had handled many uncomfortable situations in his life, but something about this conversation made it feel more personal. It wasn't just about his work anymore. It was about him as a person, his identity. And Karen seemed determined to tear that down. He paused for a moment, trying to stay calm. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on them now, some looking away, others watching with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Daniel knew this wasn't going to end quietly unless he stood up for himself. Karen wasn't finished, though. She continued speaking loudly, as if trying to get everyone's attention. "I just don't get how the FBI can let someone like you represent them. Aren't you supposed to be able to handle whatever comes your way? You don't exactly seem like someone who could take on a dangerous criminal." The words hit harder than Daniel expected. There was no mistaking it now. Karen wasn't just doubting his abilities. She was insulting him, questioning his worth as an agent and as a person. Her words weren't subtle anymore, and Daniel could feel the anger rising in his chest. But he knew he couldn't let it show. He had worked too hard for this moment in his career to let someone like Karen ruin it with her narrow-minded opinions. "I've handled dangerous situations before," Daniel said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I've done it without needing anyone's approval. What matters is the work I do and the results I achieve." Karen smirked, clearly not convinced. "Well, I'm sure you've tried your best," she said dismissively. "But I just can't picture you in the same league as the people you see in those FBI movies. They always look so, well, different." Daniel was done. He knew he didn't need to prove anything to her, but hearing her talk so disrespectfully made him feel the need to stand up for himself, for the hard work and dedication he had put into his career. "The FBI doesn't hire based on looks or stereotypes," Daniel said, his voice strong. "It hires people who are capable of doing the job, no matter who they are or how they look." There was a brief silence. Karen seemed taken aback, maybe for the first time in their conversation. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Daniel had remained calm, but his words were clear, and they held weight. The tension between them hung in the air, and it seemed like the entire plane was holding its breath. What would happen next? Would Karen push further, or would she finally back down? Daniel couldn't say for sure, but he was ready to face whatever came next. The silence stretched on for a few moments, and Daniel could feel the weight of Karen's gaze on him. The tension in the air was thick. Passengers were now looking in their direction, some trying to avoid the scene, others curiously watching the exchange. Daniel had said what he needed to say, and yet Karen didn't seem to be letting go of the conversation. Daniel shifted in his seat, trying to regain his focus. He didn't want to spend the entire flight arguing with someone who clearly wasn't interested in learning anything. His job was important, and his time was valuable. But Karen, it seemed, had other plans. "Well, I'm sure you're proud of your little job," she said after a long pause, her voice cutting through the air. "But it just doesn't seem like it fits. I mean, how many people like you really make it in the FBI anyway?" Her words hit hard, but Daniel didn't let it show. Instead, he took a deep breath and let his mind settle. He had worked hard for everything he had achieved, and no one, especially not someone who didn't know him, could take that away. "You're right about one thing," Daniel said, finally turning to look directly at Karen. His voice was calm, but it held an edge of authority. "I am proud of my job, and I've worked hard to get where I am, just like anyone else. It doesn't matter what people think or say about me. I know what I can do." Karen looked taken aback by his response. She hadn't expected him to speak with such calm confidence, but Daniel wasn't about to back down now. He had dealt with enough disrespect over the years to know how to handle situations like this. "It's easy to assume things about people when you don't know them," Daniel continued, keeping his voice even. "But making assumptions based on looks or background doesn't tell you anything about a person's abilities. I don't need to fit anyone's idea of what an FBI agent should look like. I just need to do my job well." Karen's face twisted slightly, as if she didn't quite know how to respond to his calm, reasoned approach. Her earlier smugness had faded, replaced by a sense of discomfort. It was clear that she hadn't expected him to stand his ground so firmly. "I guess you've got a point," she muttered, though it was clear she didn't really believe it. "But I still don't understand how someone like you could get into a place like the FBI." Daniel could feel the weight of her judgment, but he didn't let it distract him. The FBI is about finding the right people for the job, not about how they look or what you might expect. I'm not here to fit a stereotype. I'm here to do the work that needs to be done. At this point, a flight attendant walked by, noticing the tension between them. She gave Daniel a polite smile and then turned her attention to Karen, who had been speaking loudly enough for others to overhear. The attendant, sensing the discomfort, kindly offered to help. "Is everything okay here?" the flight attendant asked, her voice soft but firm. Karen, realizing that her behavior had drawn attention, quickly straightened up in her seat. "Oh yes, everything's fine," she said, her voice a bit too sweet now. "Just a misunderstanding." Daniel could see that Karen was trying to backpedal, but it was too late. The other passengers had already seen how the conversation had played out. They had heard the disrespect, and now there was a sense of quiet support for Daniel. He had handled the situation with patience, dignity, and professionalism. As the flight continued, Daniel returned to his laptop, trying to ignore Karen's lingering presence beside him. He knew he had stood up for himself, and that was all that mattered. The rest of the flight passed without incident, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He had faced an uncomfortable challenge, but he had come out on top, not because of his strength, but because of his calm, his words, and his unwavering belief in his ability to do his job. The remainder of the flight was quiet, but the tension in the air was still palpable. Daniel could feel Karen shifting beside him, clearly uncomfortable after their conversation. She had been quick to judge him, but now, in the silence that followed, it was clear that she was unsure of how to respond. Her earlier confidence had faded, and she had lost her smugness. As the plane cruised steadily through the clouds, Daniel kept his attention on his laptop, but he could still sense Karen's presence. She was trying to act casual, but her movements were stiff, and every so often, she would glance at him, her expression a mixture of frustration and disbelief. It wasn't long before Karen spoke again, but this time her tone was different. It wasn't the mocking tone from earlier. Instead, she sounded somewhat tentative, as though she were unsure whether to continue. "Look, I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable," Karen said, her voice quieter this time. I don't know. I didn't expect you to be so calm about it." Daniel didn't respond right away. He had heard her words, but he wasn't sure what she wanted from him. Was she trying to apologize? Or was she simply trying to brush it off as if it didn't matter? He had no interest in forcing an apology from her. He simply wanted the situation to end on a note of mutual respect. Finally, he looked at her, making sure his gaze was steady but not confrontational. "I understand that people sometimes have different views, but there's a way to express those views without being disrespectful." Karen seemed to think about his words for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, you're right," she said. "I guess I just assume things without really thinking about it." Daniel didn't feel the need to push her further. Instead, he nodded once, acknowledging her admission without holding onto the conversation any longer. He had learned long ago that some people would never truly understand, but that didn't mean he had to keep fighting every battle. Sometimes it was enough to simply stand his ground and allow the situation to resolve itself. Karen turned back to her seat, and for a while, they both sat in silence. The flight attendants came through the aisle, offering snacks and drinks, but Karen didn't say anything more. She seemed lost in thought, perhaps reflecting on her earlier words. Daniel, for his part, focused on his work, making sure that the rest of the flight would pass without further incidents. But then, unexpectedly, Karen spoke again. This time, her voice was much softer, and there was an apology in it that Daniel hadn't expected. "I'm sorry if I offended you," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to make you feel small. I guess I let my own assumptions get the best of me." Daniel looked at her for a moment, considering her words. He didn't feel the need to hold a grudge. After all, everyone made mistakes. It wasn't about being right or wrong. It was about the way we treated each other. And at that moment, Karen had taken a small step toward understanding. "It's okay," Daniel replied, his voice calm. "I appreciate you saying that." The flight continued, and the rest of the journey passed without further drama. Daniel could sense that Karen, though still a little uncomfortable, had learned something important from their interaction. Whether or not she fully understood the impact of her words, she had acknowledged that her judgment had been wrong. Daniel sat back in his seat, feeling a small sense of relief. The situation had been tense, but he had handled it the best way he knew how, with patience, understanding, and a steady resolve. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone. He already knew who he was and what he could do. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. As the plane began its descent, Daniel leaned back in his seat, finally feeling the sense of calm. The tension that had hung between him and Karen earlier seemed to have lifted, leaving behind a quiet that felt almost peaceful. He had stood his ground, and now the flight was nearly over. He had handled the uncomfortable situation the best way he could, without losing his cool or letting the situation escalate. Karen, who had been seated beside him for the entire flight, was still looking out the window, her face thoughtful. She didn't speak to him again after her apology, but Daniel noticed she was no longer staring at him with judgment. There was a quiet understanding between them now, though neither of them had said much more since their brief exchange. The other passengers had returned to their own activities. Some were reading, others were talking quietly, and a few were already preparing to gather their things for landing. Daniel knew that the flight would soon come to an end, and with it, the chapter of his brief encounter with Karen. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign illuminated, Daniel gathered his things and prepared to disembark. He stood up, grabbing his bag from the overhead compartment, and turned to leave his seat. That was when Karen spoke up one last time. "Hey, thanks for handling everything so calmly," she said, her voice quieter than before, but sincere. "I've had a lot of time to think about our conversation, and I realized I was wrong. I shouldn't have said the things I did." Daniel stopped for a moment, looking back at her. He hadn't expected any more words from her, but now that they were spoken, he found himself nodding. It was clear that Karen wasn't trying to make excuses. She was simply acknowledging that she had made a mistake. "I appreciate you saying that," Daniel replied, his tone kind but firm. "It's easy to assume things about people when we don't take the time to understand them. But we all deserve to be respected, no matter what." Karen looked down for a moment, perhaps processing his words. Then she met his gaze again and offered a small smile. "You're right," she said quietly. "I'll try to be more mindful in the future." With that, Daniel nodded once more, offering her a polite smile before walking down the aisle toward the exit. As he stepped off the plane and into the airport terminal, he felt a small sense of satisfaction. He had handled a difficult situation with grace and strength, and in the end, it had led to a moment of understanding. It wasn't a big victory, but it was a reminder that standing up for oneself, in the right way, could sometimes make a difference. As Daniel made his way to the baggage claim area, he couldn't help but reflect on the flight. It had been uncomfortable at times, but it had also been a learning experience. For both him and Karen. He had always believed in the importance of respect, and though it had taken a little while, Karen had come to understand that too. Daniel didn't expect to ever see her again, but he hoped that their brief encounter would leave her with something to think about. He had shown her that one person could make a difference, even in the most uncomfortable of situations. And that was enough for him. With his bag in hand, Daniel stepped out into the busy terminal, ready to return home, knowing that no matter what others might think or say, he was proud of the work he did and the person he was. The busy terminal was filled with the usual sounds of travelers. People hurrying to catch flights, the hum of the baggage carousel, and the chatter of families reunited after a long journey. Daniel moved through the crowd with ease, his steps steady, but his mind still reflecting on the flight. It had been an unusual and uncomfortable experience, but now that it was over, he felt a sense of quiet pride in how he had handled it. As he reached the baggage claim area, he glanced around for his suitcase. It wasn't long before he spotted it circling on the conveyor belt. He stepped forward to grab it, his hand reaching for the handle. But just as he was about to pull it off the belt, he heard a voice behind him. "Excuse me, sir." Daniel turned around, a little surprised to hear someone address him directly. Standing behind him was one of the flight attendants from earlier, the same one who had asked if everything was okay between him and Karen. She was smiling, but there was something different about the way she looked at him now. something warm and genuine. "I hope you don't mind me approaching you," the flight attendant said, her voice kind. "But I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled yourself back there." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I'm not sure what you mean." The flight attendant laughed softly, as if she'd been waiting for the chance to tell him something. "I was watching from the front of the plane," she explained. "And honestly, I was impressed with how you stayed calm. Even when things got uncomfortable, it's not easy to stay that composed in a situation like that." Daniel felt a small smile tug at the corners of his lips. He hadn't expected anyone to notice, let alone compliment him for handling the situation. He had just been doing his best to remain professional. "Thank you," Daniel replied, his voice warm. "It wasn't easy, but I just tried to keep my cool." The flight attendant nodded, but there was something more in her eyes now. "I could see that," she said. "But what I didn't expect was what happened next. After you spoke to her, Karen went straight to the back of the plane. And do you know what she did?" Daniel looked at her, puzzled. "What do you mean? What did she do?" The flight attendant smiled knowingly. "She apologized. To me, to the other passengers, and to the crew. She said she had judged you wrongly, and that she was sorry for how she treated you." Daniel was taken aback. He hadn't expected Karen to take responsibility for her behavior, let alone apologize to others. It was a small, unexpected twist, but it felt good to know that his words had made a difference, even if it hadn't been immediately obvious. "Wow," Daniel said softly. "I didn't think she would do that." "She was embarrassed," the flight attendant said. "But I think it was your calm response that made her realize she needed to reflect on her actions. Sometimes people need a little wake-up call to see things from a different perspective." Daniel nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He hadn't needed her apology, but hearing that Karen had taken a step toward understanding made the whole situation feel a little less frustrating. It reminded him that standing up for what's right, even in the smallest ways, could have an impact on others. "Thank you for telling me," Daniel said to the flight attendant. "It means a lot to know that things ended on a positive note." She smiled and gave him a small nod. "You're welcome. Just keep doing what you're doing. You never know how much of an effect it can have." With that, she turned and walked back toward the gate area, leaving Daniel to finish collecting his things. As he headed toward the exit, he felt a small sense of pride in what had happened. The flight had started off uncomfortable and tense, but it had ended with something positive, a small change in someone's perspective. Daniel hadn't just stood up for himself. He had shown the power of kindness and calm in a moment of conflict. As he left the terminal and stepped out into the bright sunshine, Daniel couldn't help but think that sometimes even the smallest gestures could lead to unexpected changes. And that made all the difference. Daniel stepped out of the airport, feeling the cool breeze of the late afternoon brush against his face. It was a welcome feeling after the long flight and the quiet moments of reflection that had followed. As he walked toward the parking lot, his mind kept returning to the conversation on the plane, to the discomfort he had felt, and to the surprising change in Karen's attitude. He had never expected that his calm response would lead to an apology, let alone a shift in Karen's perspective. Most people who held such deep assumptions didn't usually change their views so easily. But in a way, Daniel realized, maybe that was the power of simply standing firm and treating others with dignity, even when they didn't deserve it. He opened the door to his car and settled into the driver's seat, his suitcase resting on the passenger side. As he started the engine, his phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was a message from his colleague, Sarah, asking how the trip had gone. Daniel smiled to himself as he typed a quick reply. "Long flight, but made it back. Had a moment on the plane, but everything's fine now. Thanks for checking in." He put his phone down and drove toward home, the familiar streets and buildings welcoming him back after his time away. But his thoughts were still on the flight, on the strange encounter with Karen, and on how, despite the uncomfortable moments, he had learned something important too. It wasn't just about how he had handled the situation, it was about how people could surprise you. Sometimes, even when you felt certain that someone wouldn't change, they could. It wasn't about forcing your views on others, but rather about showing them a different way of seeing things, an approach that didn't involve judgment or assumptions, but respect and understanding. When Daniel got home, he unpacked his bag and sat down on the couch. He kicked off his shoes, feeling the weariness of the trip finally catch up to him. But even as he sat in the quiet of his apartment, he felt a sense of peace. The situation on the plane had been a test, and not just for him. Karen had been tested too. It was clear now that people weren't as fixed in their ways as they sometimes seemed. They could learn, they could grow, and sometimes they just needed the right moment to realize it. And while Daniel had stood up for himself, he had also unknowingly helped someone else see beyond their own limited views. The phone buzzed again, this time a call from his boss. He answered quickly, already knowing what was coming. It was a follow-up on a case that he'd been working on before the flight. The conversation was brief, and by the end of it, he felt his focus shift back to the work he loved. As Daniel hung up the phone, he sat back and reflected on the day. It had started with a simple flight, but it had turned into something more. Sometimes, even the smallest encounters could leave a lasting impact. And today, he had made a difference, not just by doing his job, but by staying true to who he was, even in the face of judgment. The day ended quietly, but it felt significant. It wasn't about grand gestures or big changes. It was about the little things. The moments when someone realized they were wrong. The times when, by simply being yourself, you could help someone see the world differently. Daniel smiled as he looked out the window, knowing that while the world was full of challenges, it was also full of chances to make it better, one small moment at a time.